Hey everybody, Mr. Moffin coming at you again. We are still with AP Government, topic 1.9, Federalism in Action. This is part 3 of our video series for this topic. Previously we've been talking about policy, and we're going to continue to talk about policy in this video. Now, previously we talked about environmental policy and its connection with federalism. This time we're going to be continuing to take a look at policy, but this time we're going to be taking a look at marijuana policy and its relationship with political participation and, of course, government policy making. So, with regards to marijuana in terms of policy, it has always been a very controversial topic for sure. And in many respects, government policy has reflected prevailing popular views on marijuana. And, we'll refer to this graph a few times, but, if you take a look at this graph showing public opinion on legalizing marijuana from the Pew Research Center, you can see that this has changed, quite a bit over the last 50 years or so. And once again, that is going to be reflected in government policy. Now, when we do talk about government policy vis-a-vis marijuana, early on, traditionally, this was exclusively a state power, that the state, using its police powers, had the authority to dictate the legality of marijuana, and early on, it was pretty much universally legalized in most places at the beginning of the 20th century, and it really was more a matter of regulating, taxation and, access to some degree, but it really was fairly legal. And the bigger thing about this regarding federalism, that this was a state thing. But that's going to start to change. As we get into the 1930s, we're going to see the federal government have more of a desire to try to have regulations over marijuana in this country. And we see it first with the Uniform State Narcotics Act. And basically what this tries to do is to have, instead of a decentralized set of policies regarding marijuana laws, the federal government trying to urge the states to all kind of come on board to have a standard system. Even though the states were making the final decisions, it was an attempt by the federal government to try to convince states to have the same kinds of policies. It didn't work too well, but you see here an attempt early on to try to have a federal standard for marijuana policy. Now, it does expand a little bit further in the 1930s with the Marijuana Tax Act, and as the name implies, this is talking about federal action to have federal authority to tax marijuana sales. And once again, marijuana is pretty much legal in America for the most part, but the federal government wanted to have its authority over being able to tax that specific trade. And that's going to be significant because with the federal government using its Commerce Clause authority to create the Marijuana Tax Act, that's going to give the federal government even more authority to affect criminality regarding this particular substance. And that then brings us to 1970 and the Controlled Substance Act. Now, Richard Nixon, being elected in 1968, is going to be the first president to kind of shape modern policy on marijuana and really drugs in general. Nixon is the creator of what we will call, or what he actually call a war on drugs. This is coming at a time where there has been a very rapid change in the culture and mindset regarding drugs in this country. We saw a youth group of baby boomers, known kind of collectively as the counterculture, to show a willingness to use all types of illegal drugs now at this time. By this point in time, marijuana had become illegal in just about every state. Drugs like LSD had become illegal in basically every state, but nonetheless, young people were using it more and more commonly. And when you saw this association with increased drug use amongst the youth of America at the time, and a real push by those, especially on the left, to change a number of traditional American values regarding, sex and gender and race and faith in government, religion, all that kind of stuff. There just was a sense by the Nixon administration and actually Congress in general to have more federal authority regarding regulating the criminality of drugs. And marijuana is certainly going to be the center of the focus on this, because marijuana will be the most commonly used illegal drug in America at this time amongst America's youth. And so what this does is give the federal government broad authority to arrest those involved in drug trafficking, the selling of drugs on a fairly large basis. It also creates what's going to be called the schedule system for drugs in this country. And let's see here. If you take a look at this, it basically takes any drug in America, and remember, drug is a very broad kind of definition, and organizes it into 5 different schedules. And as you can see here on this chart, Schedule 1 drugs at the very top are seen by the government, the federal government, as the most dangerous of all the drugs. You can see here by the definition for Schedule 1 that these are drugs that are classified as having a high potential for abuse, and there is no legitimate medical use for it. In other words, these are just bad, evil drugs that serve no positive function, period. And you can see there are some pretty heavy hitters in there, like heroin, and LSD, and ecstasy. Eventually, ecstasy is put in there. But take a look at the top of the list there. Marijuana is put in there. And it is kind of interesting when you see marijuana put in this Schedule 1 category, especially when you contrast it with drugs that are in Schedule 2. For example, cocaine and opium and methamphetamines. So there's really, the federal government is telling us that marijuana is a more dangerous drug than cocaine and methamphetamines. So it kind of speaks to the prevailing values and attitudes of governments, especially of the older generation of that time period. And so we see basically a war on drugs declared by the federal government under during the Nixon administration, starting in the early 1970s. And there was a lot of prevailing popular support for that, for that viewpoint. As you take a look here, when the Controlled Substances Act is passed, it's a time where, support for legalization of marijuana specifically is exceptionally low. The vast majority of Americans wanted to keep marijuana illegal. But what is kind of interesting is that during the 1970s, when this war on drugs is started, and marijuana is kind of the focus, the center of it, support for legalization of marijuana actually goes up, and support for keeping it illegal goes down throughout most of the 1970s. So it's kind of interesting, this war on drugs, in particular a war on marijuana, loses popularity pretty early on, but as you can see in the graph, it doesn't stay that way forever. Now, with the federal government getting involved in trying to regulate drugs, specifically marijuana, this is also, of course, going to be affecting political participation via the creation of interest groups. Remember, we've said previously that interest groups are a very important part of a pluralist democracy, where there's a sense that we as individuals have an ability to have power in government, maybe not so much as individual people, but when we join groups that have a shared common interest or a shared common sense of policy goals that hopefully the government will be able to listen to. And an example of one of these related interest groups is NORML. NORML is going to be started in 1970, which is the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws. And basically it's a lobby to try to decriminalize marijuana across America. And, early on, NORML is going to have limited success in the 1970s. It seemed to have some support, but by the time we get into the 1980s, this is going to be changing. And for those of you that are maybe not super familiar with history in the 1980s, this is the rise and, kind of the the height of the Reagan conservative revolution in the 1980s and the subsequent Just Saying No program spearheaded by First Lady Nancy Reagan. And as you can see here, what had been a trend in support for legalizing marijuana goes back down again through heavy federal desires to promote the Just Say No program, the creation of the DARE program across America's schools. I, as a kid growing up in the 1980s, was very, very familiar with lots and lots of anti-drug, public service announcements. Some of you may have parents that remember the fried egg commercial that talked about, drugs will fry your brain. And marijuana certainly was at the center of that idea. But by the time Reagan leaves office and we get into the 1990s, values are changing once again. And it marks the beginning of what has been now pretty much a continuous, unbroken trend over the last 30 years of growing support for the legalization of marijuana. And with that starting to happen, then you start to see more of a sense that government policies are going to have to change to reflect that. And as early as the 1980s, actually, you start to see some of the more liberal Democrat-controlled states, like, for example, Oregon, beginning to decriminalize small possession of marijuana. And what we mean by decriminalization, and this is an important thing, it's not a repealing of marijuana laws. In other words, it's not legalization. It's just simply the notion that if you are in violation of, for example, marijuana in small amounts, a few ounces in a given state like Oregon, you are not going to go to jail for that. So that's an important thing. One of the major effects of the war on drugs has been a massive increase in incarcerations in both state and federal prisons regarding drugs, be it drug possession, which is the most common one, but also drug trafficking for sure. We also are going to be seeing changing views on marijuana in part, not just because of just a cultural sense that marijuana may be perceived more and more as not inherently as dangerous as other drugs like heroin and cocaine and things like that, but also more and more evidence to show that there may be medicinal benefits to the use of marijuana. Evidence to show that marijuana can be used to reduce pain, particularly for those folks that have glaucoma, or to aid with those that have anxiety and depression. So as we go through the 1990s in particular, there's a growing sense in changing cultural values regarding marijuana in terms of its perception of being dangerous and addictive, and also its idea of potentially having actual medical benefits. And that, of course, is going to lead to changes in policy. And we will round out that those changes in marijuana policy in our next video. So this is part 3. Part 4 will round out topic 1.9, and we will see you then. Take it easy. Bye-bye.